Good afternoon and welcome to Growing Your Customer Base. Financial institutions are working to get online account opening right, which can be a challenge as banks seek to provide a seamless experience while managing fraud. In today's webinar, we'll discuss managing this risk while improving digital onboarding overall and promoting growth. We thank you for joining us. I'm Emily McCormick, the Vice President of Research at Bank Director. I coordinate and execute our research projects, including our annual surveys and ranking banking study. I also write for Bank Director Magazine and for bankdirector.com. Today's webinar is brought to you by both Bank Director and Alloy. An information resource to the financial community since 1991, Bank Director focuses on the strategic issues most fundamental to bank executives and boards. Alloy covers compliance and fraud fighting needs by connecting financial companies to data sources that help them verify identities and monitor transactions to gain a complete view of each customer. Before we get started, let me review just a few housekeeping items. First off, you've joined this webinar in listen-only mode, so don't worry, we can't hear you. We do recommend that you click on the slide bar at the bottom of the screen to put the presentation into full screen mode. If you have questions for our speaker, just note those by clicking the Q&A button found on the right side of your screen. You can do this at any time during the presentation, and we definitely encourage questions. Once our presenter has finished with his talking points, we'll have a Q&A period and we'll address as many questions as we can. There's no need to take detailed notes. We'll share the presentation with all attendees within 24 hours via email. You'll also be able to find it on both bankdirector.com and alloy.co. If you have any technical issues, you can also note those using the moderator chat feature found on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll do our best to take care of it. And finally, the opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the individual speaker only and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the other speakers or of the entities with which the speakers are associated. With all that, let me introduce our speaker. Andrew Martin is Director of Data at Alloy, where he helps financial companies onboard quality customers while combating fraud. He previously ran data and technology teams in the public sector. Andrew, I'll pass it over to you.
All right. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. Just confirming that my slides are coming through clean.
Yes, Andrew, we're seeing them.
Perfect. So today we're going to talk about how banks and other financial institutions can solve this very vexing challenge of wanting to grow, wanting to onboard more customers, while also wanting to maintain a compliance posture that keeps you in line with all regulations, and a fraud posture that prevents identity theft, identity thieves, and other fraudulent actors from using your institution to conduct online fraud. Alloy's in a really interesting position where we get to talk to a lot of different players in the online and digital banking space, both traditional large financial institutions and new startups that are trying to solve unique or new approaches towards providing financial products online. And in our conversations with these different actors, we've heard a lot of different trends come out. Particularly, we've heard a lot of challenges and trends around identity, especially when identity verification needs to be done over the internet. There's a couple different facets that we think our banks have to solve for when they're trying to solve this identity challenge when opening a new account or making a new relationship online. You have to answer the question, is this a real person? Synthetic fraud is a real and growing threat to financial institutions, where someone might be applying with a set of identity elements that appear in public records, but don't actually map back to a real person. They map back to a synthetic identity that's been created specifically for the purposes of defrauding financials. Once you've identified whether or not this is a real person, you have to verify that this person is who they say they are, that they're not using a stolen identity or they're not impersonating someone else's identity that they have access to. If you've verified who the person is and you know that they're a real person, you have to assess the fraud risk from first-party fraud. So is there any pattern around this identity or these identity elements that is associated with first-party fraud, with someone defrauding a financial institution in their own name using their own real identity? And then later on, after you've opened up that relationship, you have to, assess credit risk, and you have to do ongoing compliance, both, sort of watch lists and ongoing monitoring and anti-money laundering screening when you're, transacting with this customer who now has an account with your financial institution. So a variety of different challenges that banks face. And at Alloy, we think that we've identified some approaches that really help banks solve these problems without sacrificing the need to expand your customer base and deliver a very seamless experience to customers online, the kind of experiences that customers expect when they're engaging with the digital application. If you don't get this right, there are a lot of consequences for banks. Lost customers is probably the most obvious one. If your fraud rules or your compliance rules are set up where they're overbroad or they're too strict or they're creating a lot of sort of false positives, you lose a lot of good customers. These are customers that you spent a lot of money marketing towards. You've done outreach to these customers. You've brought them in. They've made that application. And if you're not approving those customers for reasons that aren't that sound, you're losing thousands of dollars in lifetime value from that customer and all of this sort of wasted effort of marketing to that customer. If you approve a fraudulent customer, there's very, very, very sort of potential fraud exposure, high potential fraud exposure from letting bad actors into your system. So it could be losses that you have to write off. It could be risks that this individual exposes you with other institutions. So we see tens of thousands of dollars in fraud exposure for just one bad account. And then compliance risk. If your examiner or if your regulator decides that your controls and your customer information program don't meet muster, there's potential for huge fines or even worse, sort of threat to your banking license. So big consequences for financial institutions getting this right. One of the things that we've really seen in Alloy is that as banks move towards truly digital first experiences and towards digital account opening, is that the risk to the bank is really very different online than it is in person. So if you're an institution that is sort of tends to serve individuals in a certain part of the country, if you're sort of a regional institution, you tend to get a good picture of who your customers are. There's sort of a geographic net that you cast, and you meet people in person when they come into the bank, and you're able to sort of manage risk both because you get to know that customer base and because there's just sort of the basic geographic constraint of people have to show up in person to your institution to try to open an account. When you're opening digital accounts, risk is effectively unbounded. Your beauty of the internet is that you can market to any individual anywhere in the country, so your addressable market goes way up, but so does the sort of fraud exposure. If you're an institution that doesn't have good fraud prevention and good sort of screening rules when you're opening up digital accounts, the potential for fraudulent actors to sort of self-select and target your institution really does go up. And that's something that's harder to do when there's the sort of constraint in place of having someone show up in person. Digital risk can be, sort of an order of magnitude greater, depending on, the quality of the program that you're running. And this is something that was really borne out in the past year with the PPP program, a program that, banks and the government was trying to get out the door quickly. So there was a big incentive and an interest in getting these, applications approved quickly. And, one of the things that, some retrospective analysis of the data that's come in around PPP is that it's not a situation where fraud was sort of like evenly distributed across all lenders. It wasn't a situation where, there's fraud. It's 1 out of every 100 applications. And, it's sort of a random draw depending on, how many people apply to your institution. Fraud was really concentrated in certain online lenders who had either not best in class fraud prevention technology when they were originating these loans, or were not, doing the right kind of due diligence. And there's sort of an interaction effect here, right? There's word gets out that a certain institution might not have sort of the strongest controls in place, and then bad actors flock to that institution because they realize that's where the defenses are weakest. So you really have to, think about your program, and you have to think about how it compares to other institutions that are out there. You don't want to be the institution with, sort of the weakest fraud prevention program, because your, level of risk that you're going to see is not just sort of, 1.5x individual with a good program. It can really sort of be an order of magnitude larger. if you're running the weakest program sort of in the industry. So when we talk to a lot of institutions, the challenge that they bring to us is that they've been using a sort of a fairly traditional approach to online identity verification or digital identity verification, and they're seeing a lot of challenges. And internally, we sometimes call this approach the sort of tack on another data source approach. So let me tell you what that looks like. Often this starts with a system that was built out of a core banking system. So reliable, great products, but institutions and systems that were not built for sort of online banking, were not built digital in mind. And you start with sort of basic information that might have been added 15 or 20 years ago, where the first thing that we're going to do when we're doing digital identity verification is we're going to run somebody through a public record search. We're going to run them through a database of driver's licenses, mortgages, all the sorts of public records that help verify someone's identity. And then we're going to come up with a couple of different knockout rules. We're going to sort of say, like, okay, if this social security number is reported to somebody who's dead, like, that's a knockout rule. If this social security number isn't valid, or it uses sort of a numbering system that's sort of not consistent, that's going to be a knockout rule. And then over time, the needs of the bank grow and another source gets tacked on. So perhaps the bank sees first-party fraud, these accounts being overdrawn and then sort of left in a negative balance, and it adds a credit check, or it adds another type of a product that assesses the creditworthiness or reports back whether or not an individual has left an overdrawn account at other institutions. And then as you move more digital, the bank a couple of years later adds on another service, like a device profiling service that wants to look at the IP address, wants to look at information about what device this application is coming from, and profile that for fraud. Because these rules sort of accrete over time, because these rules sort of are layered on, tacked one on, as you move up, as you move down the stack, you can only ever reduce your approval rate, because there are sort of rules that knock someone out at the sort of first stage, public records, and there are more rules that knock someone out at the second stage, credit, more rules that can knock someone out at device, and error gets amplified over time. So that if you're going to, like, let's say that you want to sort of up your fraud defenses and you want to add another check in there, sort of out of the gate, you're only going to be driving down your approval rate, because it can only possibly add another reason for somebody to be rejected. It can't increase your approval rate by giving you access to more and better information. So this like linear tack one on sequential approach amplifies the error from any individual source, and you end up with like a very, very high manual review or rejection rate, often based on criteria that we know are noisy and overbroad. So this approach really doesn't work well, especially when you're trying to adopt a digital first, sort of a modern digital account opening experience. It slows down the onboarding process, because every thing that you add is another independent call. So there's sort of this like loop of data sources that are being called, and it adds more time to the application. The decision logic tends to be either extremely limited or very closely tied to the software logic in the banking core. So a lot of times, when we talk to institutions that are trying to modernize their decision criteria, making any changes to any one of these data sources requires a software ticket, requires software development process. There's, sort of a very slow cycle on how you can change and tweak and iterate these rules. And the complexity of what you can say, the kinds of conditional logic that you might want to apply, is very limited. It's sort of everybody moves through the same pathway. And the knockout rules tend to be very broad, and they result in a very high false positive rate, which I just alluded to on the previous slide. So what's the alternative? If banks are trying to improve their fraud posture online while also trying to increase approval rates, how can you design a better system that doesn't fall into these sort of pitfalls that we identified with the tack one on approach? And we call this approach data orchestration. So data orchestration means that you're grabbing from a menu of the best-in-class data, and you're not going sort of one data source, wait, two data sources, wait, three data sources, wait. You're calling out to all those sources at the same time. You're bringing all that data back. You're normalizing, standardizing it so that it's all mapped to the different entity identity elements that are are present in the application. And then you're making a decision that takes into account all of the information that you have, and a decision that uses sort of the best available information for all of the different things that you're trying to decide. So, the two things that really make this different is, first, that you're sort of using a data marketplace. You're not having to build sort of individual software features into your system. You're able to sort of toggle mark things on, toggle mark things off, sort of add more data as appropriate. And then the second thing that really distinguishes this is that it's simultaneous. So you go out, you get all the data you need, you get that back really quickly, and then you're able to sort of like jointly consider all of that data together to make the best-in-class decision about the types of risks that you have. So what does this look like in practice? So banks control the front end. Banks control the experience over here with the sort of iPhone logo. No one's going to Alloy.com to submit their application. Your systems are talking to our API on the back end. So there's a front end that the bank is collecting all the information that they need about this person's identity, and then that information gets posted to our API. And when we have all this sort of standard information that comes across for a banking application, we then help you run it through a workflow that can include 2, 3, 6, 7 data sources. It can include data sources that are used conditionally, like data sources that you don't need to use all the time. But if you get an application that you think is slightly higher risk, you want to sort of give it more scrutiny, then you throw this data source in as well. And then the rules, which the bank controls, full sort of decision rights over, like how the criteria, and the decision is made, result in an outcome. So it could be approval, it could be denial, or it could be some type of manual review process where there's more scrutiny put on the applicant, maybe more information like, document verification might happen to help you, decide whether or not this individual is who they say they are. And then, then you have like a, sort of a fully automated pipeline. One thing that I want to note here is that because, we're back-end infrastructure, because we're, a system that can power a lot of different experiences, and we work with, everyone from sort of, large top 20 financial institutions to very new startups that, haven't even had their first sort of complete client yet. This can be both a digital experience where this information is being collected from a website, a web form, a mobile app, anything digital, or it can also be an in-branch experience where an individual is walking in, they're giving this information to, a banking representative, and then the bank is sending along additional information that might reflect in-person checks. So, in addition to this information like DOB, SSN, and address, you might be passing along, sort of what identity documents were verified by the teller in the in-person branch experience. We've had a number of successful implementations use Alloy not only for digital experiences, but unifying all of the new account creation processes so that in-branch is covered as well. And I believe it said in the intro document that we're currently working with 85 different data sources. That number sort of grows every week. One of the nice things about like working with a company like Alloy is that, we make it our business to, number one, know what's out there, sort of really understand the landscape around, data and identity verification. So, we have a whole team that is sort of talking to new vendors, trying to understand what their value proposition is, trying to understand like what type of information this is going to provide a bank, and help them sort of improve their posture. But also, we're doing the work to sort of integrate these data sources and to standardize all the goofy things that, if you've ever run a software process, come up. Like, this data source wants names passed in this way, but this data source wants names passed in a slightly different way. All those sorts of, tendentious details are handled by us. And, inside of the Alloy universe, it's sort of a plug and play kind of approach. You can kind of turn on new data sources. You can test out a new data source. And, as of right now, we're working with 85 different data sources, and that number, as I said, gets bigger every week. So we've talked about some of the challenges that financial institutions have. We've talked about, why a traditional approach, the TAC 1 on approach, isn't well suited for the types of, decisions that you're trying to make, especially for digital onboarding. We've talked about what data orchestration is. Why is data orchestration better? Like, what are some of the results you can expect if you move from a very traditional TAC 1 on approach to a modern data orchestration engine? So one of the things that's really great about data orchestration is instead of a sort of set of knockout rules where adding a data source means that there's only more reasons to reject someone, orchestration means that you can have different data sources here represented by, sort of different colors and different sort of boxes here that are all being mapped back to different identity elements. So when you're trying to make a decision about something like address match, right? Addresses are one of the things that are notoriously hardest to match. They're they're the identity element that, we see generally the sort of lowest confirmation rate on. And that makes sense. My date of birth never changes. Like I always have the same date of birth. Your name might change a few times in your life, once or twice in your life, but names generally tend to be sort of low velocity changes. But addresses change a lot. My address has changed 4 times in the past 4 years. And, getting coverage of all the addresses that are out there is not a perfect science. It, varies from vendor to vendor. So, sort of one of the sort of like simplest ways to sort of demonstrate the benefit of data orchestration is, you can have 3 data sources that are verifying someone's address and 2 that are not, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to reject the applicant if there's sort of no indication of fraud, if there's no indication of sort of, campground mailbox, high velocity of suspicious applications at this address. If it's just that like data source C hasn't seen this address before, no problem. Data sources A and B have seen this address, so you have, sort of a very rich paper trail that you can use to sort of show that you did due diligence, show that you verified this person's identity, and you don't have to reject this individual just because one data source wasn't able to match their address. So, what's an example? The last time that I moved, I was working here at Alloy, so I had the, privilege of seeing how my information flowed through different, data sources that were out there. And, we moved to our new address, and we ran this new address about a month after we moved through a variety of different data sources. You could see that, my name was matched in all 3 of the sources that attempt to verify names, but my address was only matched in sort of 2 out of the 4. There were two systems that had not seen this address yet. Maybe they, didn't have access to the mortgage records or what have you. But there were 2 that were able to verify it. So I was able to be approved for a new product that, was being offered by one of. And using multiple data providers simultaneously in the same workflow means that, if we have, sort of two hits on Andrew's address, we can consider him verified, even if data source 3 hasn't seen this address before. And that reduces the need to send me to manual review. That reduces the need to request a utility to bill for me. All things we know that are just, absolutely killer to conversion rates for online accounts. When individuals are applying for online bank accounts and they get thrown in some sort of a review queue asking for a utility bill or another statement that verifies their address, oftentimes they just move on to another competing product. They don't go through a days-long process to verify something like an address that can be very, sort of burdensome and time-consuming. Gather that additional information. And, for another type of thing that you might be thinking about, like a concern that banks have, so for identity theft, here's an example of my information run through like a very common identity theft pattern where someone has somehow, gotten access to, my name, my social security number, my date of birth, but they're opening a digital account. So they're not using, obviously the email address that I control. They're using an email address that was purpose created to, use this stolen identity to try to apply for digital products. So someone comes up with an email address, Andrew Martin, NJ 2019, and they try to apply in my name. And, you can see that what happens here is that, the email that's associated with this application is viewed as very suspicious. The fraud risk comes back as very elevated because this is not an email address that's ever been used by me before. And in fact, one of the data sources finds out that there is an email address that is used with this combination of identity elements a lot, and that's my real email address. And if this individual can't prove that they control this sort of good email address that's associated with my identity, they're probably not who they say they are, and you shouldn't be opening an account with them. Anecdotally, this is something that we hear from a lot of different players in digital identity, that one of the most challenging things, to do is to create an online persona that matches the behavior of a real person. It used to be that, 10, 15 years ago, the thing that was the skeleton key, the master lock to my identity, was the fact that I know my social security number. Just knowing my social security number doesn't really prove anything anymore, but proving that I have access to this email address, which has been open for 16 years now and has been used to sign up for mailing lists, has been used to sign up for cooking websites, for 12 years. That's very, 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 very hard to spoof. And the consistency of the relationship between my name, my date of birth, that email address is just like a very powerful signal that this is a real identity that has existed on the internet for a long time. And it's a pattern that's very hard to recreate. If you get a hold of someone's identity, you can't go back in time and create a set of relationships that look as, sort of normal as sort of the real activity of an individual over the course of years. And these types of sort of, places where digital signals are inconsistent, they don't match, they don't correlate, they don't follow traditional patterns, are some of the best signals that you're going to get that someone's using a stolen identity or a composite identity to try to create access to a banking product. And one of the things that a lot of people have asked us about is what some of the trends are that we've seen over the past year. Obviously, as banks, whether or not they wanted to or not, were running branchless operations last spring. We've seen, definitely an uptick in suspicious or high-risk applications over digital channels. So comparing 2019 pre-pandemic to activity during sort of the height of the pandemic last year, we saw a 137% increase in high-risk applications come through digital channels. And, those were all applications that our customers were able to combat really effectively. But the threat is, definitely getting bigger as digital account opening becomes more widespread. There's more bad actors out there that are looking to come through those channels. So we talked about what, the sort of the nuts and the bolts of how data orchestration can help you make a decision about an identity. What are some of the outcomes that people have seen using our product? So these come from white papers that we have sort of published, and you can find more on our website if you're interested in. But things that we're really proud of is a very high automation rate. So a 95% reduction in manual reviews has been a pretty consistent experience using our product. The number of individuals that you have to still make a human in the loop decision about this identity goes dramatically down when you have access to better data. And that drives up the automated approval rate. So that both means that you're spending, sort of less money on back of the house, sort of call center costs to have individuals, talk to a representative to verify information that is verifiable in other ways. And it means that, consumers get their decision much faster. And really quick approvals are, absolutely essential for driving conversion rates. And then, this is also something that we're very proud of on the left, which is our customers have seen both a reduction in fraud. They've seen, sort of an actual reduction in fraud losses because access to better data helps them stop the kinds of identity theft patterns that you can see at account opening. And they've seen a lift in, good accounts. So they're getting both, sort of more accounts opened, more good accounts opened through their digital channels, and they're taking less fraud, which is, often, something that they've previously thought that those objectives, sort of were, in conflict with one another, that if I allow more individuals through, I'm going to increase my fraud rate. We actually have seen individuals able to sort of solve both goals at the same time, or we've seen institutions able to solve both goals at the same time. And, sort of finally here, what's the evidence that this holistic approach works? Why does data orchestration, sort of prove out over, sort of the TAC 1 on approach? We did a study where we looked at sort of the individual contributions of different data sources towards an overall conclusion. And the services that we used were a traditional credit product, a device profiling service that just focused on what's running on the phone, non-traditional data, social data, web data, sometimes called sort of alternative data. We used one of those services, email history, email analytics service, classical KYC public records service, and then a consortium service where banks, credit card companies, utilities, almost anybody that opens up accounts submit first-party fraud that they've taken. And you can see that, there's signal from every one of these individual services, so if you look at the phone or the device analytics, it doesn't detect, that much of the overall fraud, but it has a very low false positive rate. Like when it's telling you something is wrong, like it's usually very wrong because the patterns of like a spoofed, emulated device look very different from the patterns of a, sort of normal consumer using their phone or using their web browser to apply. KYC and consortium data catch a big chunk of the fraud, but often have like fairly high false positive rates. Like, you're catching 64% of the fraud, but you're, turning away 7.5% of, sort of good customers who are customers that you want to have, doing business with you. You marketed to them, you acquired them, don't turn them away, for fraud or compliance reasons when you don't have to. But when you're able to sort of like consider all of these sources together, when you're able to sort of put them all in the same workflow, consider all of the data at the same time, denoise all of these individual services, all these individual indicators that all have, sort of true signal, but they also have false positive, we're able to attain a 90% fraud detection rate with only a 2% false positive rate for a client that we worked with. And that's just the power of aggregation, the power of considering all the data simultaneously and looking for places where, data source A does a great job, and then you fit it like a puzzle piece with data source B, and you're not amplifying the error, you're reducing the error because you have, sort of best-in-class data considered all together. And, this is something that we've seen transform other sectors of the economy as well. So, when I was growing up, there'd be like one national poll, and that poll would be reported in the newspaper, and that would be taken as sort of, truth about like what the state of a political race was. But, services and websites like 538 have taken the approach of aggregating multiple polls, of taking a broad amount of information in and trying to sort of figure out, like, by using averages, by, sort of discounting outliers, by looking at the independent contribution of every individual piece of data, can you get a better picture of the overall state of something that you care about? And, that's definitely been a revolution in, sort of political science journalism. And we think that this type of approach, where you're not just relying on sort of one data source, hard set of knockout rules, you're taking all the data in and you're making a sort of holistic determination that is, back tested and uses the best available data. There's strong reason to think that this is what's true for polls, is true for getting data about people who are applying for bank accounts. More data averaged together helps reduce the noise and get you the sort of best possible signal about what to do about individuals that are applying. So that takes us to the end of the slides that I presented. I'd love to talk through any questions that anyone has right now.
All right. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for that fantastic presentation. And yeah, to our audience out there, if you have any questions, we're going to just use up the rest of our time to try to address as many of these as possible. So definitely feel like you can submit them. We'll just, again, try to get to as many as we can. So I do want to encourage you to take advantage of this time. So Andrew, first question, what are some of the emergent trends that you're in fraud protection that your customers are adopting?
So two things that I talked about three things that we've seen customers adopt that have been really successful. One is there's new and sort of emerging services that attempt to do synthetic identity detection that differ from just sort of the bank of services you may have used for KYC and verification before, and they come out of online lending, come out of like online data science teams that have had to sort of solve this problem in-house and have found sort of patterns that synthetic identities, identities that have been created and submitted to the credit bureaus. So they're identities that like exist in these databases, but they don't map back to an actual real person. We've found those to be like very, very impactful, especially for anyone who's doing any sort of lending, especially for anyone that has what they would consider to be credit risk. Synthetic identity is just like such a vexing problem because, you did the due diligence, you checked up on this person, you got a response back from a vendor and they said like, yep, like this is a name and an SSN that we have in our system, except, it was put in there maliciously. So, synthetic fraud is definitely, a fraud trend that's been on the rise. And we've seen, customers, bring that in and really sort of, mitigate that problem in their workflow. Another trend that we've seen has been more in-depth device profiling. So oftentimes, if you're under attack from a fraud ring, or if you're under attack from an individual who is engaging in identity theft, they're not just sitting in front of a computer typing information in. They're often trying to sort of use dumps of information. They're trying to sort of throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall and use automation to sort of apply for products. So having basic bot services in your workflow is considered a best practice. CAPTCHAs and those types of anomalous activity. But we're able to get even more in-depth information about like what kind of a machine was this running on, what was the browser doing, is there any hint of emulation, is there any hint of sort of the speed at which certain elements are typed in or put in that are indicative of automated activity. Because when I apply for a bank account, I'm not applying for a bank account using a script, right? I'm typing things in the way a human does. So we've definitely found those to be very effective, especially at stopping coordinated attacks. And then I think I said I had 3, but I gave you 2, so I'll stop there.
Okay, that sounds good. I mean, I think a huge point is that the fraudsters keep getting smarter, so the banks have to get smarter than them for sure.
Yep.
Another question, you've got so many data sources that you guys weave in over at Alloy. Are there new sources of data? Because there's been all this talk about alternative data, it seems, for years now. Are there some sources that are particularly promising in conjunction, of course, with other methods?
Yeah. So, some of what I was talking about when I was giving that example of, the sort of spoofed email address, using a database of fantasy baseball websites that I signed up for in 2006 is not going to pass muster from, sort of verifying my identity in a bank grade kind of context, right? Like the fact that I put that into a web form in 2006 is not, proof positive that I am who I say I am, but it is a sort of digital exhaust trail that's consistent with a real person. So that's a way that you can sort of leverage, sort of broad alternative data that, you're not using that for, sort of your KYC name check, but you are using that to sort of see from a fraud perspective, is there a pattern of web activity that's, sort of representative of a real person who has, sort of real online activity, who's signed up for stuff, whose, name has been accidentally, breached in, in a data breach in 2012. Like that's happened to most real people, right? It hasn't happened to an email account that was created 7 days ago for the express purpose of applying for a bank account in your name. So, I think that like sometimes we recoil from, sort of stuff that was, taken from, potentially like low, sort of low quality online sources. Like obviously we're not using that to verify someone, really is who they say they are in a, Bank Secrecy Act kind of context. But from a fraud prevention context, that type of like digital paper trail is really, really very powerful. And it's, it makes it harder. It sort of raises the cost for bad actors. They have to then go try to sort of purchase old real identities and try to graft them onto sort of new stolen accounts, and that creates its own pattern of sort of negative signals. So you're sort of raising the cost for a bad actor to engage in these attacks, especially these attacks in bulk, and raising the cost means that you deter the behavior.
Absolutely. We've had a question that came in regarding integration for Alloy. And the question is, are you integrating with all of the major banking core providers, their online and digital account opening platforms? And is there one or some more than others?
Yeah. We've had success with all of the major cores. We've had success with, cores that maybe were just for sort of savings and loans. We've had success with, new fintechs that have decided not to use a traditional banking core or have their own sort of, challenger core. We've really assisted in modernizing, this process for a number of our customers who are using traditional cores. And I think the thing that we've heard feedback back is that, because there's sort of this separation of concerns, right? If you use our product, you don't have to worry about the software integration logic. You don't have to worry about, how Equifax gets called, how many times we retry, how, that all the name fields get mapped back from XML into the right services. You just know that, like, at a high level, we talk to Equifax. Equifax gives us the data we want back, and I can manipulate it. So the integration layer we handle, and we give you a very clean surface to work off of, and then executives who define the strategy around retail banking are able to use our product to express the business logic. Like, here's where our application logic lives about how we want to make decisions about risk, about how we want to, sort of certain populations or certain targets that we have, sort of goals around, like sort of improving our approval rate for, individuals under 22, because they're often signing up for new bank accounts. Like, here's how we're able to, increase approval rates for individuals that we've had a tough time verifying in the past. Maybe we go and we sort of get more information, so we have a lower risk of, sort of rejecting somebody, incorrectly. That's been really successple. And, one of the things that we're proud of is the sort of the velocity rate at sort of like small changes, about small learnings that you have over time. As you, are in the market, you're in the field, you're working with consumers, you see something that was a mistake, you get in there and you fix it. The sort of time to turn that around in our system is minutes. So the number of small changes that we see our partners making is often in the hundreds over the course of a year. Whereas if that was like, at the software layer, everyone knows that just moves slower. So you're not going to see the same like ability to sort of like make fine-grained changes to your workflow.
All right, and we actually have another implementation question as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this viewer says, a typical implementation of Alloy seems to include, and I'm going to butcher this, Okta or ForgeRock to actually run, is it IAM or IAM in the online banking or customer experience channel to provide step-ups or additional friction in the onboarding, access, or transaction capability space. Is that a long-term role for your product?
So I work on a lot of implementations. I will say that I heard Okta. My experience with when we've done implementations with systems like Okta is we're integrating with a bank's SSO for employees. So there's the integration that we do with sort of like bank personnel, right? Because you want your reviewers, you want your call center team, you want your executives, you want anybody who has compliance concerns, you want any fraud investigators, you want different layers and different levels of permission on agents. So if I had the question from the individual in front of me, I'd love to ask sort of a follow-up, but trying to understand the question as best I can. I would imagine that you might be reading something about what we've done to integrate with the bank's SSO system to give agents the right kind of role-based permissions, and that's something that we've done really extremely successfully. We know that inside of banks, there's huge concerns around how you protect personally identifiable information. You don't necessarily want every individual who has access to online system to be able to sort of like go and dump the identity elements for an individual. You may just want them to be able to sort of see certain fields or not see certain fields. So we have role-based permissions that we work with our banking partners to sort of understand, like, how do you define sort of the layer cake of permissions and access inside of your system, and how should that map onto our agents? For individuals or consumers who are applying, there's definitely not any sort of gating system that you would need to use Alloy. Like, if you look at our developer docs, there's a API endpoint, api.alloy.co, and any backend system that just posts, name, address, DOB, address, that's all that's needed to interact with us. So there's not sort of some extra special thing. There's not like an additional layer of contract that you need to work with the product in an implementation. But if you do have a single sign-on provider, if you do have a way of sort of doing your federated identity on the bank side, we're definitely able to consume that and map that to the right permissions for teams that need to use our product. Hope
awesome. Well, I'll let you know if we hear anything else from him. If you've got a follow-up out there, feel free to send it. But what type of impact do banks or financial institutions tend to see on their account opening rates when they're using something like Alloy?
Yeah. So faster, right? So Alloy doesn't add a lot to the time it takes to make a decision beyond what it takes to talk to, the third-party data sources. So, if you're talking to a credit bureau, public records, alternative data, and device, to take the sort of the slowest response, right? And we're going to be just a couple hundred milliseconds added to the sort of slowest data vendor that you're talking to, because we're making all these calls, at the same time, getting all that information back. When the last data vendor checks in, then we do everything we do, wrap it up, give you a response. So considerably faster, right? So individuals are getting, often it depends on, your classic answer, like it depends on how much data you're using. It depends on whether or not you, want to conditionally call certain data. Some data is way more expensive than others, so you might want to sort of put your cheapest stuff up front. And then, if somebody applies with Bugs Bunny, I'm not going to run Bugs Bunny through, the very expensive credit bureau verification, because I know that Bugs Bunny's not a real person. But all that to say that often in, under 2 seconds, 1.5 seconds, you're getting a full response back. So the individual is not submitting something and then waiting to hear back through another channel. It's really fast enough that individuals are sort of like sitting on that screen waiting and then getting their response back in real time. So faster experience for consumers is something that we're, really, really proud of. And we know, empirically from talking to banks, if you can get that real-time decision, if you can get that individual to stay on the screen and get a decision about the product that they applied for, you just see much, much, much higher conversion rates than any time you have to then sort of call someone to action, text them, email them, say, hey, remember that thing you applied for, even 20 minutes ago, they're picking up their kids, they're at the grocery store, so faster. And then a reduction in reviews. So, one of the things our partners have told us is that their manual review teams are able to clear their queues almost immediately, and they're able to give much more, time and attention to applications that come through, where it's like, okay, can I go get more information about this individual, or can I put this individual through a step-up challenge, like an identity, identity verification, selfie plus ID, that's going to kind of reduce my concerns about, impersonation or identity theft. So reduction in reviews, but then also better reviews. You don't have teams that are overburdened just trying to work through queues.
Yeah. Speaking of that, with Alloy, you're going to see that shift, as you said, from manual review to more automation. Ultimately, that's a good thing for banks. It's a good thing for employees, and not having to be burdened in that way. But it is a change, and you've got to manage that change. Do you see some banks that are more successful at this than others?
Yeah, it is a change. We've worked with a lot of institutions, so we know that sometimes, different parts of a bank or different departments in a bank have their own goals and their own priorities and their own objectives. I think that if there's an overarching strategy, if the bank kind of feels the need for digital transformation, if the bank knows that this is not sort of experimenting with the internet anymore, it's not like, do new consumers expect to be able to open their accounts over the web? That's just kind of a reality. It is increasingly become something that consumers expect when they're applying for a new financial product, that they're not going to have to go, show up with documents at a place and time. So I would say that customers, clients that we work with, that sort of start from that compelling need for change, that they know that, we have to move to a truly digital online account opening. And the question is, how can we do that securely? We tend to have that tends to be the best experience, because, we speak we speak regulatories, or however you would say it. Like, our sales team, our implementations team has worked with lots of different compliance teams, has worked with lots of different, Bank Secrecy Act policies internally. So, we speak the language of your compliance team, we speak the language of your product team, and we've generally been able to find the kind of like right balance of, sort of risk posture, compliance posture, growth posture that kind of maps back to what the bank is trying to do.
Sounds good. To everyone out there, just a reminder, we do have a few more minutes for questions. So if you've got something, definitely don't hold back. We'll try to get it addressed. So another question, Andrew, what if your organization wants to use a machine learning model rather than rules?
Yeah, great question. Something that we've definitely seen and heard customers ask us is, over time, they want to start with best practices. They want to start with, like what's the sort of recommended way to use these data sources. And the great thing about a lot of the data sources that we're using is that you are using machine learning kind of already out of the box, right? Because a lot of these data sources give you back some sort of a risk score or an index score. So they're running a model, and then they're giving you the output of a model, right, which might range from 0 to 1, or it might range from 0 to 1,000. So, when you're making a decision, when you're sort of picking a slider on a threshold, you're actually already sort of consuming the results of a model. So even sort of a customer getting an out-of-the-box experience from us is leveraging machine learning already. They're leveraging multiple machine learning models, sort of run by our data partners to give them sort of an all-in-one, sort of one-dimensional slider that you can sort of like figure out where you want to make a decision about risk. But for customers that want to go beyond that, right, customers who may be bringing significant data to the question, right, they might be bringing data about like what channel this individual applied on. They might be bringing data about the prior relationship with this individual, right? None of these data vendors know what you know about your customers, and we know that applications don't just come from individuals on Bankrate.com. They also come from internal campaigns. They come from cross-sell and marketing opportunities that you have with people who already have a relationship with you. So if you know a lot about an individual already, and you gather this additional information at the point of application, you may want to leverage that in something sort of like more sophisticated than a pure decision tree. And our product has the ability to integrate banks' custom models directly into the decisioning workflow in Alloy. So oftentimes what that will look like is that there'll be sort of like the compliance rules, right? Like we're not gonna build a machine learning model that determines whether or not your social security number is invalid or is associated with somebody who's dead, right? Like that's not the kind of thing you model. That's a criteria, right? That's a rule. So the compliance rules will tend to stay, signed off on by the compliance team, fixed and, kind of hard coded. But then the decision about risk is going to take into account everything we've learned that the customer is bringing, and then everything you learn about the individual. So you can pipe that information into a model and then use the output of that model in our workflow to make a decision in real time. So that can be on your infrastructure. So we have customers who, give us an endpoint, and, we give them developer documents about, okay, here's how the data is going to come to you. Here's the naming conventions. Here's, what to expect. And then here's how to respond back and give us something that we can work with in your model. Or you can work with our team and, sort of send us your fitted model, send us, sort of anything from the sort of traditional machine learning stack we're pretty good at working with. And we can host that for you, sort of put the machine learning model into production. We've done it both ways for customers and have been very successful. We're, have more and more customers that are doing credit on our product using that kind of approach. And we found that, the same type of modeling approach that you might want to have around fraud risk. It's a very similar type of question when you're trying to make a decision about credit limit, or you're trying to make a decision about, whether or not credit should be offered at all to an individual. That's often the output of a model. So matrix models, 2x2s where you have, some criteria that you're trying to decide on, and you want to kind of box them and make decisions in different places. Those have been used successfully, as have more kind of classical machine learning approaches, random forest models, XGBoost. Yeah, so, we love this stuff. We have a team of sophisticated solutions folks and, people on my team to work with you. So it starts with, the best practices. It starts with the kind of received wisdom about how to use this data the best way. But as you learn more and as you bring more of your own data to the table, you can often sort of even improve upon that by running your own fraud model.
Now, Andrew, what if a bank wants to work with a vendor and Alloy doesn't have an existing relationship with that vendor? What happens?
Yeah, right. That's a question we sometimes hear is that, sort of we use vendor X, we love vendor X, we have a long-term contract with vendor X, how does this work? Like if I move to your platform, am I constrained? The good news is that like that's a relatively small fraction of the types of implications that we see, and it's going down every month as we add more vendors and we sort of work with more people. So the good news is probably this is not something you're going to have to worry about because we probably already work with the vendors that you have in mind. The second thing that we do in implementations is, it is in our interest and your interest for us to work with new vendors. So we will often, sort of move a vendor up the priority list and we'll integrate a new vendor specifically for a client that wants to use our product, but, has like a hard, project requirement that like, I need to be able to use this vendor. It's like, well, we love data vendors. So if you have something that you think is great and you want to use, we can often work out an understanding where, like we'll do the back-end work to integrate with that vendor and you'll be up and ready to go. And if, either of those don't solve the problem, some of our customers either who have their own internal services that, they don't really want to expose, they don't want to like sort of treat them like, a public API, or if they have something that's particularly kind of far afield, they just bring that data along at the point of application. So they'll sort of talk to that vendor, get the information they need, and then bring that along with the name, address, date of birth. And so you can sort of bring an additional data source with you when you make that initial, post to our API. We're able to really flexibly, we do all the normal stuff, name, date of birth, address, but then if you have something crazy that you need to bring along, we've handled lots of different things. So, either we have it, we'll get it, or you can bring it along with you.
Well, with that, I think it's time to close this webinar out. Andrew, thank you for answering all of these questions. It's been super informative. To our audience out there, as a reminder, you'll receive the recorded version of this webinar within 24 hours. We're going to also post this webinar on both bankdirector.com and alloy.co. And thank you, Andrew. This has been great. I want to thank you and thank Alloy for co-hosting today's webinar. And thanks to everyone out there joining us today. Y'all have a great rest of the day.